Hello and welcome to part one of the lecture for April 8th. I'm really glad you guys are sticking with this course, and I know we're going to get through this semester together. So as I told you in one of the announcements I sent out, this lecture tonight is divided into two parts. So at the end of this video, you will watch part two, and I'll explain why as we go along. So by tonight, you should have already completed several assignments. Our assignments from last week included watching the video How to Take a Quiz on Blackboard, completing a practice quiz on Blackboard, reviewing textbook pages 208 to 223, and reading 283 to 300. So all of those assignments should be done by tonight, which is April 8th. So tonight we're going to finish chapter 7, that is part 1. In part 2, we are going to start and finish chapter 9. We are taking a quiz next week. The quiz will be taken on April 15th between 6 and 8 p.m. If you need to take the quiz at a different time, you need to contact me via email, and the deadline to let me know you need a different quiz date or time is 8 p.m. on Tuesday, April 14th. You might think I'm being a bit of a taskmaster, forcing you to take quizzes at a certain time. My intentions here are really good. Students can very quickly get behind if they're putting off things like, I'll watch the video in a couple of days, or I'll take the practice quiz tomorrow, or I'm going to wait to the last second to take the quiz for tonight. There's a lot of reasons not to do that. The primary reason is because you don't want to get behind. And I've been teaching an online course for 6 years that's taught entirely online, just like you folks are doing now. And the students who do well in that course are the students who complete the assignments assigned every week on time. Students who fall behind very quickly. And it only takes postponing getting work done 1 or 2 weeks, and all of a sudden you're a month behind and cannot catch up, and you either fail or do poorly in the course. So I'm not going to let that happen to any of you, and we're going to keep all on time and on schedule, and you're all going to do well. Okay? So project 7, it's a really easy one, and we'll talk about that later. So there's been an awful lot of odd rumors floating around the student body, and I just wanted to address a couple of them to make sure that none of you are thinking maybe any of this stuff is true. The first is that HVCC students this semester are getting a tuition refund. So students can just decide this semester doesn't count and get a full refund of their tuition. I can assure you that is not true. There is another rumor going around that we're not going to have final exams, or that whatever grade you had at your course at midterm is going to be your final exam grade, all kinds of crazy stuff. None of it's true. Your final exams will still be given in any course that has a final exam. The only difference in our course is the final exam will be done on Blackboard, but you absolutely are having a final exam in this course. There's also these silly rumors going around that students, if they express they've been stressed out or having difficulties due to the coronavirus situation, can get an automatic A grade. I can guarantee you that is not true. So as you're hearing different rumors and picking up different things, please make sure to check your source. The only official news about our college comes from the president of our college or another staff or faculty member. So unless it comes from them, just automatically assume it's not true and make sure you double check. As I said, our final exam is still going to be on May 13th, same date, same time. The only difference is you're going to take the final exam on Blackboard. So you will be taking our final exam on May 13th between 6 and 9 p.m. The only difference is you're going to do it online. If you hear about anything or hear any rumors or stuff going on and you want confirmation, please send me an email. If I don't know the answer offhand, I will find the answer for you from another staff or faculty member. Don't believe the hype. I redesigned the main menu on our Blackboard page for a couple of reasons. One is that we didn't really use Blackboard as a main source of information for the first half of the semester. So the way I had it arranged worked just fine. However, now that we're relying entirely on it, I wanted to try to make it easier for you to find things. So on the left of your screen, you'll see what our main menu looks like now in Blackboard. So the first item is announcements, then you have lecture, slides, quizzes, projects, and we have a new participation policy we're going to talk about. So in the item called lectures, that's where you're going to find the recorded lectures like the one you're watching and listening to now. I'm also still going to post my slides for you. So in the slides section, you're going to see just the regular PowerPoint slides, no audio. You won't have to hear me talking at you, and you can just review the slides like you did prior to the midterm exam. So just plain old slides will still be posted every week, and they will be under slides in the main menu. Under slides, you'll see quizzes. Every quiz you take for this class will be located here right on the main menu. Our final exam will have its own tab, and you'll see that when that comes due. And underneath quizzes, you'll see projects. We had this on the main menu before. I just made it easier to find. So if we have a project assigned, like tonight, you're going to get project 7. I'm going to tell you about the project in the lecture. I'm going to email you the project, and I'm going to keep a copy of it for you on Blackboard under projects in the main menu. Underneath projects is participation. We'll talk about that just in a moment. And there's a lot of other items still underneath participation. That's where our course syllabus is. The glossary is still there. But I just wanted to point out these changes to the top of the menu so you don't have to waste time figuring out where something is that you need to look at. Any questions about that? Send me an email. So as I mentioned, we have a new attendance and participation requirement. Please don't panic or stress. It's really not a big deal. So you'll see in your email a copy of the new policy. It goes into effect tomorrow, which is April 9th. We've had a participation and attendance requirement the whole semester, so this is really nothing new. But now that we're not in class and seeing each other live every week, you can't really attend class in the usual way, and nor can you participate in the usual way. So if you are one of those folks who felt very comfortable talking in class and asking questions in class, we can't do that right now. So all I've done is I've just changed the requirement. It's really not a big deal. So participation is first. You're going to submit one academic question per week. That's it. You're going to send me an email with one academic question. Academic questions would be like, what's the difference between voluntary or involuntary manslaughter? Or I can't tell the difference between the mens rea and the elements. Can you explain the difference? Those are academic questions. The questions that will not count for your participation requirement are things like, when will the lecture be posted? Or how many pages are in chapter 10? That's not going to count for your participation requirement. So just one academic question per week. Real easy. It'll take you just a couple of minutes. And for attendance, the way we're going to score your attendance from here forward is that you complete tasks on time. So if you have a project due April 15th and you submit it on April 15th, bang, there's your attendance requirement done. If you have a quiz and you take it on time, that's your attendance. So just completing tasks on time. And again, not trying to be a taskmaster, just trying to keep us all on pace so none of us fall behind and you can all do well in the course. So again, you'll see the new attendance and participation requirements in your email. There's also a copy of it located on our Blackboard page in the main menu under participation. So now let's get back to some academic material. We're going to start with offenses against a family, which begins on page 208 in your textbook. You remember at the beginning of the semester, we talked about social norms, right? So every culture, every society, even every age group has its own informal rules that people expect you to follow. So remember we talked about a social norm being you don't wear white to a wedding. Okay, in the American culture, only the bride wears white, so you wouldn't wear white to a wedding. If someone offers you their hand for a handshake, you shake their hand. That's just a cultural norm. It's not a law. It's not written down anywhere. It's just things that we've learned from our families, our grandparents, our religious institution, our community, right? So just informal rules. So in every culture, society, and religion, they have their own definitions as to what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, which also means that what is art and what is pornography really depends on that individual community or culture. In 1814, many people thought the painting by Ingres that you see at the right was scandalous and obscene. People thought it shouldn't be displayed, it should be destroyed, and no one should be able to create paintings that looked like that. And now, of course, it's displayed in the Louvre and it's widely praised as a masterpiece. So, what we deem to be pornographic at one time, our opinions can change about that over time. So, what is considered to be obscene is often a personal choice. So, why the heck are we talking about this? Because pornography is an issue in the law. And the first case that really made a statement about this, and it's a case that you need to know and remember, is Miller versus California, which was decided by the United States Supreme Court in 1973. So what happened was California had a law that prohibited distribution of what they called obscene material. And this guy, Miller, made what we call adult films, and he printed some flyers advertising those films for sale. And those flyers or brochures included photos of adults having sex. And he mailed them out wide scale to a bunch of people to try to sell his films. Well, one of the recipients of that flyer took great offense to the images that arrived in her mailbox, and she asked the police to arrest Miller for distributing obscene material. So to her, it was obscene. To Miller, it clearly was not. This case worked itself all the way through the court system for years, all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had to issue a decision in which they defined pornography. So the Supreme Court had to give some guidance to people as to this is what obscene means. This is what pornography means. And this is a very difficult thing to do. For one reason, as we discussed, everybody's different. What you may find to be obscene, I may think is fine. What's acceptable in one culture is not acceptable in another. And now, famously in 1973, the United States Supreme Court has to state what is obscene for all of us. So not an easy task. And U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stewart is famous in this case for describing how difficult it is to define pornography by stating, I know it when I see it. And a lot of us feel that way. If we're asked to decide whether an image is obscene or not obscene, we're going to say, well, let me see it. And I'm going to look at it and I'm going to decide based on my own culture, my age, my religion, whether or not it's obscene. And Justice Stewart just said, look, I know it when I see it, meaning I don't know how to describe in words in a real brilliant way how I'm making this determination. But nevertheless, the Supreme Court had to issue a decision. And in this decision, it's a very famous case, and it provided us what we call the Miller test, named after Mr. Miller, or it's called the three-prong obscenity test. So if someone is arrested for creating or distributing or possessing obscene materials, this is the test we use, and this is the test a prosecutor would have to use to prove that the material is actually obscene. And the three parts of the test are: 1, the average person applying a contemporary community standard would find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to prurient interest, and prurient interest just means sexual interest. So that's the first part of the test. Part 1 is the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work taken as a whole appeals to prurient interest, meaning it appeals to a sexual interest. And then you have to go to part 2. The work displays or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct as defined by state statutes. So the work displays or describes in a patently offensive way. Patently offensive means that it's obviously, clearly offensive. Sexual contact or sexual conduct, as those are defined by state statutes. So right now in part 2 of the Miller test, we can see that what may be pornography and obscene in one state is not pornography or obscene in another state, because each state gets to decide how it defines sexual contact or sexual conduct. And the third part of the test is the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Again, this is a tough one, right? How do we define community standards? Whose community? My community? Your community? Some other guy's community? Whose community are we basing the standard on? And who gets to decide whether something has literary, artistic, political, or scientific value? But again, the Supreme Court doesn't get to say, well, we'll decide each case as it comes along and apply different community standards depending on who brought the case to us. That, of course, is not how the Supreme Court works. They have to issue a decision that gives us a detailed, specific test that prosecutors, police, and judges can apply throughout the justice system. So this is what we came up with for the 3-part obscenity test, otherwise known as the Miller test. And note that when it says the work displays or the work taken as a whole, this could mean it's a painting, a photograph, a cartoon, a magazine, a movie. It could apply to just about anything that somebody can produce. And the Supreme Court did not define for us in this case, what does community standards mean? Or what has literary value? So it's the best test they could come up with, and it's the test we still use today. But of course, there's still a lot of ambiguity here, right? So why are we talking about pornography in this class? Well, that's because it involves the criminal law. Prior to the 2000s, pornography laws were primarily aimed at prohibiting the sale of pornographic magazines and films to minors. And for this purpose, minors are people under age 18. So if Playboy magazine contained naked images of adult women, that was determined to be pornography and could not be purchased by somebody under age 18. Now, back then, in the olden days, it was pretty easy to police this stuff, right? You could have a shelf in a store like the one you see pictured, which blocks by the shelf and blocks by the packaging it's in, being opened or purchased by somebody under 18. And there's a note you can sort of see there that says, we sell adult-oriented magazines to those 18 or older. Please do not open sealed magazines. So back then it's pretty easy. And then this whole thing called the internet explodes in all our lives. And all of a sudden, all kinds of pornographic images and films are widely available, not just on your computer, but of course on the phone that you hold in your hand. So this has made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to police minors purchasing pornographic images and other works. So this is a real difficult one, and I don't see a lot of case law on this, nor do I see a lot of arrests for this either. So this has changed drastically over time. What has not changed drastically is child pornography, which of course is a very different thing. When I talked about pornography being legal, although restricted, those involve works involving people who are 18 or older. Child pornography involves sexual, obscene images of children, of people who are under 18. That is illegal in all 50 states. It's against the law to possess child pornography, create it, distribute it, or promote it. And those are all separate offenses. So this is not legal anywhere in the United States. And remember the term strict liability that we talked about a while back? Strict liability means no intent is required. So you don't see knowingly, intentionally, purposefully in these statutes. What you see is if you possess it, you've broken the law. If you create or distribute it, you've broken the law. And I have heard in different cases someone claiming that they had no intention of accessing child pornography. It simply popped up on their computer like an ad for something for sale on Amazon. And that simply just doesn't happen. It has to be sought out. It is something that you have to search for. And if you search for it and it's on your computer, you possess it. And therefore, you have broken the law. Of course, the internet has allowed the child pornography industry to flourish, and it is extremely difficult and time consuming for law enforcement to track down perpetrators. They do it and they do it well, but it is very difficult to do and it is time consuming. One thing that came up of interest a few years ago when cell phones became really popular, and not just among adults, but when teenagers and even younger kids began owning cell phones that they primarily had unrestricted access to, then we got issues with sexting, meaning that someone's sending a naked picture of themselves over the phone through a text message to someone else. And the way the child pornography statutes were set at the time, a 15-year-old girl could take a naked photo of herself and send it to the other 15-year-old boy that she liked over the phone. And the way the statutes were written then, that meant that 15-year-old distributed child pornography. Yeah, even though she sent an image of herself that she took, the laws are very strict. And the way they were written was if you created or distributed or possess an obscene image of a child under age 18, then you broke the law, period. So the 15-year-old couldn't defend herself by saying, yeah, but I just took a photo of myself and no one made me, and I just sent it to somebody who's a friend of mine who I wanted to see it. That wasn't a defense then. Of course, because when they created the law, they didn't imagine the invention and proliferation of cell phones, right? They couldn't have imagined how a 15-year-old could take an image of herself and send it to somebody electronically. So it took years to get those laws straightened out. And you can find, if you Google it, instances of teenagers under 18 being charged with possessing, distributing, or creating child pornography because they were taking images of themselves or each other and sending it amongst themselves. So most of those statutes have been straightened out, but you can find that if you look for it. So penalties for child pornography, meaning creating, distributing, possessing, or promoting it, are very severe. For example, in New York State, Penal Law Section 26305, which is use of a child in a sexual performance, is a Class C felony. So that's prison time. However, you'll see a lot of these child pornography cases are actually brought in federal court. And there's two reasons for that. One is because if you distribute or share anything online that's illegal, that's a federal crime. So, for instance, even if you contacted somebody in Pennsylvania to sell them heroin, that is a federal crime because you're doing it online. And of course, anything online crosses state borders. If something crosses state borders, it can be brought in federal court and the feds can take jurisdiction over it. So distributing or sharing any child's pornography online is a federal crime. The second reason these charges are often brought in federal court is because the penalties are more severe. The state penalties may be tough, but the federal penalties are the toughest. And they have pornography laws in the federal system that can get you 35 years to a life sentence for creating, possessing, distributing child pornography. So there's two reasons why child pornography charges are often brought in federal court instead of state court. One is because it's a federal crime to distribute and possess such issues through the internet, and also because the federal penalties are actually more severe. So while the Albany County District Attorney could bring a child pornography case in Albany County Court, they're more likely to let the feds and the FBI and Homeland Security take over that charge and bring it in federal court because the penalties are so strict. I'm going to move on to a different topic. We're going to talk about intimate partner violence. This is also called domestic violence. One reason that more people in the social services and law enforcement fields call it intimate partner violence now is because domestic violence sounds like it has to take place in your domicile or your home or residence. And that's not what this is about. So, intimate partner violence or domestic violence always involves a current or former intimate partner committing certain acts against you. So, this is not someone who's a stranger to you assaulting you on the street. This is someone who you used to be married to or date or live with who is now committing acts of violence against you. And there's different forms of domestic violence. And one of them is forced isolation. Forced isolation means preventing or making it hard for someone to see their family or friends, telling them that family and friends cause problems in the relationship and they're trying to come between you, and you shouldn't see your mom, and you shouldn't talk to your cousin, and you shouldn't be friends with that guy anymore. And it's this constant and consistent trying to isolate someone away from their support system. Another form of domestic violence is economic control. That means one person takes complete control over the money, won't let someone have access to checking or savings account, taking your money from you, forcing you to turn your paycheck or over earnings over to your partner, or not even letting you go to school or have a job and earn money that can help you support yourself. Verbal or emotional abuse is another type of domestic violence, calling names, putting you down, embarrassing someone, criticizing their abilities, telling somebody constantly that they're worthless or no good, or if you lose me, you'll never find anybody else who loves you. Constant put downs and criticism, all of those things would constitute verbal or emotional abuse. Then there's also intimidation. That's making somebody afraid with a look, an action, or a gesture, getting you to do something about reminding you, yeah, don't forget what happened last time. It's intimidating someone to the point where they're constantly afraid. Coercion or threats is much more blatant. That would be showing someone a weapon, threatening to use it, threatening to out your personal secrets to friends and family members or employers, actually threatening your friends, family, or coworkers, or anyone who might be available for you to go to help. Also, it would be threatening to commit suicide and saying, if you break up with me, I'm going to kill myself. If you break up with me, I'm going to kill your dog, would be another example of coercion or threatening behavior. Then there's also physical abuse that could include pushing, grabbing, hitting, slapping, punching, kicking, choking, stabbing, burning, shooting. There's all sorts of forms of physical abuse. Sexual abuse is also an element of intimate partner violence. Sexual abuse could be forcing someone to have sex when they don't want to, or making them engage in sexual acts that make them feel uncomfortable or that they don't want to do, or forcing someone to engage in acts of prostitution, which could also get you a charge of promoting prostitution or sex trafficking, depending on the circumstances. There's also stalking. Stalking, is behavior that you're familiar with. Stalking could be waiting outside of your job and you have to have contact with this person when you don't want to. It could be staying outside of your home, hiding in your bushes, constantly following you around and taking photographs of you, texting you 200 times a day, sending you images you don't want to see. Stalking behavior takes a lot of forms. Perpetrators of intimate partner violence will also use children to abuse someone, and they can do that by using children as informants, saying, I want you to tell me where mommy was last night, or who was daddy with, or who did daddy have over at the house. So it's basically using the children to spy on the other partner. It can also be a means of threatening consequences for somebody. To threaten someone that if they don't do something, you'll hurt their kid is a pretty powerful thing. And all perpetrators of domestic violence or intimate partner violence minimize, deny, and blame. So minimize could be something like, I didn't hit you that hard. Denying could be, I didn't do it. I never hit you. Or blaming the victim, saying, well, the reason I hit you is because you didn't have dinner ready on time. Or the reason I won't let you have access to our money is because you're too stupid to handle it and you'll buy stupid things with it. So all perpetrators of intimate partner violence minimize, deny, and blame. I put the website up here for you for the New York State Office of Prevention of Domestic Violence. It's a great website if you ever are looking to get help for yourself or for someone you care about, or maybe you're doing an academic project about domestic violence. This website contains great statistical information, descriptions of domestic violence, and all sorts of resources. There are plenty of websites out there that are really helpful for information on domestic violence, but that's one of them from our state. Intimate partner violence or domestic violence is more widespread than most people believe. In the United States, 33% of all women and 25% of men will become victims of domestic violence at some point in their lives. So that's 33% of women, 1 in 3 women, and 25% of men, 1 in 4 men, will be victims of some form of domestic violence, whether it be physical abuse, sexual abuse, intimidation, coercion, threats, some form of domestic violence in their lives. To me, this is a staggeringly high number, and I don't think this is new. I think these numbers probably are stable throughout time. It's just we have much more awareness about what's occurring with this issue now. 19% of domestic violence assaults involve a weapon. That's a very serious detail for a lot of reasons. One is because those weapons, of course, can be used on the victim. They can also be used against the perpetrator. We've had several stories in the news lately about what's commonly referred to as murder-suicides, where a perpetrator murders someone with a weapon and then turns the weapon on themselves, usually a gun. So 19% of domestic violence assaults involve a weapon. More than 50% of women, all women murdered in the United States every year, are killed by a current or former partner. So it's odd that there's so many movies and television shows and docudramas about women being abducted and murdered by strangers, people that they didn't know who just grabbed them off the street, because it's much more likely if a woman's murdered in this country that she was killed by a current or former intimate partner. Calls to 911 for domestic violence can be extremely dangerous for law enforcement. I know that's something you already knew, but just needed to say it. So it's much different for a police officer to go to a call of a domestic violence case than it is for somebody's having a loud party. Okay. So the sites I looked at say the most dangerous calls for law enforcement involve traffic, obviously, because a lot of police officers, unfortunately, are killed by cars when they're addressing accidents. And also domestic violence cases are extremely dangerous for law enforcement officers and for social services workers, by the way. So now We finally get to it. I've been waiting all semester to talk about child abuse and neglect. As you know, this is my particular area of expertise in the law, and I've been working in this field for over 20 years. So I really wish we were together live because I had all sorts of things planned for this, but I'll do the best I can. So, historically, children have been viewed as the property of their parents, and those parents were allowed to mistreat them, including kill them, and were allowed to abuse them in any way they chose to. And by being viewed as property, I mean that literally. Children were viewed to be the property of their parents. So a parent could discipline a child any way they wanted to. A parent could choose to send their child to school or refuse to send them to school. Parents really owned their children. In 1890, the U.S. Supreme Court adopted the philosophy of parens patriae. Some of you may have heard that before if you've taken juvenile justice classes. And parens patriae is just a Latin word describing that the government can become legally responsible for children who are abandoned or orphaned. And that was a new concept in 1890. There were children living in the street who were homeless or abandoned. You can see a photograph of that from New York City, I believe, on your right. And nobody did anything about it. The kids either found a way to survive or kind people took them in. But the government didn't have any role in that until 1890. And it's a common trivia question, which actually happens to be true, that the first agencies in the United States were open for animals before there was any institutions open for the protection of children. So the first ASPCA, which stands for the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was opened in the United States in 1866. You can see from the Supreme Court case cited above, and there's a lot of information about other institutions for children that were formed much later than that. So for almost 30 years, we had agencies in the United States that were there to solely protect animals, and we didn't have any agencies that protected children. And despite these early efforts at protecting children, parents largely went unpunished for abusing or neglecting their children up until the 1970s. So even if parents physically abused their children to the point of requiring hospitalization, it was very rare for a parent to be criminally charged for that. That started changing in the 1970s and 1980s. So let's talk about New York State specifically. You'll see the blue and silver pinwheel on the right. That is the national symbol for child abuse awareness and prevention. And April just happens to be Child Abuse Prevention Month. So normally at this time of year, if you pass by your local DMV or courthouse, you might see a lot of pinwheels displayed in the lawns in front of those buildings to acknowledge and celebrate, for lack of a better word, Child Abuse Prevention Month, which lasts throughout April. So we don't see those out now for all the reasons you know about, so I put a photo up here for you. So things in New York State regarding child abuse and prevention really changed in 1973. Prior to 1973 in New York State, child abuse and neglect was largely an ad hoc arrangement, just meaning that every county, every city did things differently. Some counties had child protective services, other counties in New York didn't. Some areas solely relied on law enforcement to take care of issues regarding child abuse and neglect. And that all changed in 1973. And in that year, the New York State Legislature passed the Child Abuse Prevention Act, and it had three major components. The first one is that law required every county in New York State to have a Child Protective Services unit, what we all call the CPS unit, and that CPS unit had to be located within its Department of Social Services. So across New York State in every county, there's a Department of Social Services, and in every one of those DSS is a CPS unit. In New York City, it's arranged a little differently. But they do have a Child Protective Services unit in every borough. The second thing that law did in 1973 was it created what's called the New York statewide Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment. Most people just call it the hotline or the Child Abuse Hotline or the SCR. And there's only one of those in New York State because this act in 1973 said there will be one child abuse hotline in New York State. And everyone who calls that hotline, which is located in Albany, regardless of where that child lives, those reports will then be sent to the appropriate CPS unit in the county to investigate. And the third thing it did was that law in 1973 designated people in certain professions to be mandated reporters of child abuse and neglect. So if a regular citizen, for lack of a better expression, wanted to report child abuse or neglect, they are welcome to do that. But there's no law requiring them. If you're walking past the Walmart, walking through the Walmart parking lot, going into the store, and you see someone beating their child, there is no law in New York State that says you are required to call the hotline and report what you've seen. But the law in 1973 said that may work for what we call the regular general public, but it's not going to be good enough for people in certain professions. So there's a long list of people who have a professional certificate or license issued by New York State, and those people are required to report child abuse and neglect. And it's all the people you'd think of: doctors, teachers, law enforcement, EMTs, dentists, all sorts of people are required by law to report child abuse and neglect. So child abuse and neglect in New York State really changed for the better in 1973 when they passed a law that required every county to have a child CPS unit. It created the child abuse hotline, and it designated people in certain professions to be mandated reporters of child abuse and neglect. So again, focusing on New York State, I want to give you some statistic about how much child abuse and neglect gets reported in our state. So in 2019, just last year, the hotline accepted 195,788 reports. So 195,000 times a report was accepted by the hotline, and then it was sent to a county for investigation. So I think it's fair to call that 200,000 reports a year, and that number is pretty constant. I've been doing this, as I said, for about 20 years, and that number's always ranged between 175,000 and 200,000 reports each year. So when you call the hotline, what happens? What happens is the first thing the person who answers the phone at the hotline has to determine is what you're saying about child abuse and neglect, was it actually perpetrated by a parent or a person who's otherwise legally responsible for the child? The hotline in New York State can only accept a report if the allegations are made by a parent or a person otherwise legally responsible. So if the person is a stranger to the child, or the perpetrator is someone who doesn't have any caretaking or other responsibilities for the child, then that report has to be made to law enforcement. The hotline can't accept that report. The other thing the person who answers the phone is going to do is they're going to make sure that the allegations being made meet the legal definition of child abuse and neglect. So in New York State, parents and other adults responsible for children are required by law to provide them with what the statute calls the minimum degree of care. This includes food, clothing, shelter, education, medical care, and adequate supervision. And the standard is actually quite low. Food can be minimal. The law does not say a child has to be provided with nutritious food or food that they like or different meals every day of the week. It just says food. Clothing doesn't have to be hip, doesn't have to be trendy. It simply means clothing. Shelter does not mean it needs to be pretty or smell good or be nicely decorated. It literally means it's shelter. It's shelter that meets codes. Education means you have to send your child to school. So in New York State, depending on which school district you live in, you may be required to send your kid to school through the school year of their 16th birthday or the school year of their 17th birthday. Each district gets to make that decision. So we do have mandatory education in New York State, and people are required to send their kids to school. Medical care and adequate supervision are also required. So the standard is low. So if somebody calls the hotline and says, I know this mom and she's really mean to her kid and she calls him stupid all the time and says he's fat, that would not meet the minimum definition of abuse or neglect, and law enforcement cannot accept, or I'm sorry, the hotline cannot accept that report. If the person who calls says that the child hasn't been to school in 45 days and is failing all their classes, or the child has marks and bruises inflicted by a parent, or that the child hasn't been taken to a dentist in over a year and they have terribly painful cavities that the parent isn't taking care of, those are the sort of calls that the hotline can accept. We also don't accept calls from teenagers who call the hotline and say, my mom or dad is abusing me, and when asked to describe that abuse, say, well, they won't let me have an Instagram account, or I want an Xbox and they won't give me one. That does not fall under our minimum degree of care requirements. So the two things the hotline has to do to take a report is, one, to make sure that the abuse or neglect was committed by a parent or person otherwise legally responsible for the child. And the second thing that's required is the allegations must meet the legal definitions of abuse or neglect. Once the hotline sends a report to the county CPS unit has 24 hours to start an investigation. That can mean different things. If the hotline accepts a report that a child hasn't been to school in 45 days and is failing, the caseworker is going to do some, minimal action to get that case started. They may even just work in their office and make sure they have all the information that they need to investigate the case. If the call made to the hotline says that a dad has been smoking meth all day and he is now locked in the bathroom of the house with the children and he has a shotgun and the SWAT team is outside, well, that caseworker, even if it's 3 a.m, is going to go to that location and wait for instructions from law enforcement. But when a report is accepted by the child abuse hotline and forwarded to the county, CPS must do something within 24 hours to get that case started. And as you can imagine, CPS caseworkers work in conjunction with a lot of other systems. They work with law enforcement, human services providers, and of course, the family court system. When I do training for mandated reporters, and I've lectured and taught seminars on child abuse all over the state, one of the most controversial topics that we talk about is corporal punishment. Going back to our social norms thing, corporal punishment, which just means physical punishment, varies widely on what is acceptable in different communities, in different religions, even in different states. So what may be appropriate physical punishment in your house may be inappropriate physical punishment in another house. But the state has to define what child abuse and what child neglect is, right? That's one of the fundamentals of effective laws is we have to have it defined for us to understand it so we know what laws to follow. Corporal punishment, boy, that sure is a tough one to legislate. And in New York State, we have 2 different laws to guide us as to what is acceptable corporal punishment of a child and what's actually a violation of law. The first law we look to is the New York State Penal Law, Section 3510. And that states when a parent or another caregiver of a child, that they are allowed to use physical force when and to the extent he or she deems necessary to maintain discipline or to promote the welfare of a child. And of course, deadly force for physical punishment is prohibited because that would be a homicide. So when we look at the criminal law, The criminal law says that parents and other people entrusted to care for children can use physical force. That is allowed under New York state law. So, for example, let's say you are walking down the street and I come up behind you and I use my hand to smack you on the butt. That is a crime, right? You could have me charged under the penal law. I am not allowed to touch you in that way unless you give me permission to do that. So if I walked up to you and did that on the street, I could be arrested and charged with a crime. However, if your child is misbehaving and you want to discipline them by smacking them on the butt with your hand, that is allowed under the law. And no, it's not just limited to that. The penal law says a parent or other caregiver is allowed to use physical force. And it doesn't really define what physical force means. So the penal law gives us some guidance. So let's look to another law. The New York State Social Services law states physical punishment of a child may not be excessive. So we know deadly force isn't allowed. You're not allowed to shoot their child because they're misbehaving. But you are allowed to use physical force. But the physical force can't be excessive. So where does that land? You're told a person has physically punished their child. What do you need to know to determine if that physical punishment complied with the law or violated the law? And the factors that Child Protective Services and law enforcement use to judge the nature of a physical punishment is a number of factors, including, of course, the age of the child. While it may be acceptable to spank an 8-year-old, it is not ever acceptable to spank an 8-week-old. The child's maturity. Is the child grown up enough to even understand why they're being disciplined? The nature of the injury is certainly something that figures in. If you physically punish your child and the child ends up bleeding or bruised or lacerated or has broken bones, that certainly would be considered to be excessive. The law enforcement and CPS workers are also going to look at, is the child disabled? Punishing a child who has an intellectual or physical disability may be unacceptable when that same punishment would be fine for a child of average intelligence who does not have a disability. So a number of those factors have to be used on a case-by-case basis to determine if a physical punishment complies with the law. And just remember that we get some guidance in the law about what's acceptable. We know that deadly force is prohibited. We know excessive physical punishment is prohibited. But we also know that physical force is allowed under the law. And there's a lot of misconceptions about this. I'll hear people, mostly from my generation or older, say, yeah, now it's against the law to spank your kid, or now you're not even allowed to punish your kid. That is absolutely untrue. And in fact, the penal law supports that what would be an assault if you committed it against another adult is acceptable if you do it to a child. Now let's move from elder abuse or from child abuse up to elder abuse. So there's not really a strict definition in the law of who's an elder. Mostly we're thinking of people age 60 or older or 65 or older. Those are both generally accepted as someone being an elder or what we call a senior citizen. Unfortunately, elder abuse is very common both in New York State and the rest of the country. And like domestic violence, it takes many forms, including physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and financial abuse. So in relation to children, we already talked about what physical and emotional abuse is. In terms of neglect, elder abuse means they're just not getting adequate care. You're responsible for taking care of an elder, and that elder goes without food or medicine or medical care or safe and adequate housing. That would be neglect for an elder. And it's pretty hard to financially abuse a kid because, let's face it, they don't have a lot of money. But our elder senior citizens are often victims of financial abuse. And what that means is an elderly person has worked and saved their whole life, is now in retirement and not working, and someone steals money from them. So the baby boomers, that generation born between 1946 and 1964, well, that huge population of people are now between 56 and 74. And the population of elders is just going to get bigger in this country as those baby boomers age. So abuse of senior citizens is steadily increasing every year, and it's going to remain a serious issue for law enforcement and social services for many, many years. The most common abuse of elders that you'll see in the news right now is financial abuse. And the way people do that is they scam elders out of their money by phone scams, email, internet scams. Oftentimes, people will come to a senior citizen's home if they don't have friends or family that help them as resources and say, hey, you got horrible cracks in your driveway. Your driveway is really dangerous. You know, you seem like a nice man, and I know you're retired, so I'm going to fix your driveway, and I'm only going to charge you $15,000. And so the elder person agrees to that. And what they do is basically just, slap some sticky looking stuff on the top of the driveway, or maybe fill a crack and charge the person $15,000. And then when the senior realizes that they've been ripped off, they can't even find the person who did it. That is very common across the country, and there's a lot of helpful information about there for elders to protect themselves from losing their money. The New York State Attorney General's office has a great website, and on there's a lot of really helpful information for elders about how to know something is a scam, or how to know that to not give their social security number or date of birth out over the phone. Unfortunately, a lot of that information is on the internet, and a lot of 74-year-olds aren't really good at navigating the web. So there's been many agencies like the New York State Office for the Aging and Adult Protective Services who are trying to get that information out to seniors. However, our fine state has a big, huge failure when it comes to elder abuse. And you'll note on the map, the only state that's highlighted is New York. And that's because New York State is the only state in the entire country that does not have mandated reporting for elder abuse. So there is no person, professional, or financial institution that's required to report the abuse of an elderly person. We are the only one in the country that does not have it. So although doctors in New York State are required to report suspected child abuse or neglect, they are not required to report the abuse of an elderly person. If a bank teller notes that some kind of shady looking character is constantly withdrawing money from a senior person's account and they think it's sketchy or outright illegal, they're not required to report it. And that's a real failure. Every state, every year the legislature looks at it, and every year it doesn't pass. So why am I telling you about courses that are at the college you already attend? And that's because a lot of people who are attracted to law enforcement or a course like criminal law are attracted to trying to solve or work in these types of issues, or to gain more knowledge about these types of issues. So I just wanted to point out there's a number of classes here at the college that you can learn an awful lot about these issues. For example, in the criminal justice program, we have Children in the Law is an entire class, Introduction to Family Violence, Introduction to Juvenile Delinquency, where you get to spend the whole semester just looking at those issues. Our Human Services program has courses such as Human Development in the Family and Problems of Adolescence, which are really interesting looks at how families develop and exist and problems that happen within families. And Problems of Adolescence just totally focuses on the teenage years. The psychology department has both child psychology and adulthood and aging. The health program has drug studies, which is always a very popular class where you get to learn a lot about both legal and illegal drugs and addiction. And the sociology department has social problems, which obviously discusses a lot of these issues from intimate partner violence to addiction and poverty. So just wanted to point that out for you. Now we're going to change topics. Disorderly conduct is also referred to as disturbing the peace. You'll hear law enforcement officers call this DISCON, disorderly conduct. Every state has these laws, and they are intentionally vague. Now, I just said a minute ago that one of the foundations of our legal system is that laws have to be specific and detailed so we can understand what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. This is one area of the law that these statutes are intentionally vague, and they give law enforcement a wide range of discretion as to who is charged and for what activity or behavior. So disorderly conduct statutes are intentionally vague because the purpose is to give law enforcement a lot of discretion as to who is charged and for what activity or behavior. We've talked about the Constitution and how every constitutional right is limited. And the U.S. Constitution does provide us with the right to peacefully assemble and protest. Protest our government, protest our elected officials, protest companies and businesses that are doing something we don't agree with. We have a constitutional right to protest and assemble and say, hey, we don't like what this person or this business is doing. However, just like free speech and the right to bear arms has their limits, so does the right to peacefully assemble. For example, you may have a peaceful protest, but you're not allowed to block a public street. And in the photograph on the left, you can see protesters gathering together to bring attention to an issue that they're passionate about, and they are in a public street where there's cars. You can get arrested for that. And if you say, I have a constitutionally right to peacefully protest, they're going to say, go protest on the sidewalk. You can't block a public street to do that. People often go into public buildings, say a courthouse or the Capitol, and handcuff themselves to things so it's really hard to remove them. That's not peaceful assembly. You can get arrested for that. It's also called trespassing. So you have to be careful. You have a right to peacefully assemble and protest, but what you can do is limited by other laws like disorderly conduct and trespassing. So people who are frequently arrested for disorderly conduct are being a nuisance to the police. That's just one way to describe it. They're being a general nuisance. They're not being violent. They're not physically harming anyone, but they're being a nuisance in public. Specifically in New York State, we have a definition of disorderly conduct in the Penal Law 240-20, and it's defined as when a person with intent to cause public annoyance or alarm does a couple of things. Engages in fighting or tumultuous behavior. I love that word, tumultuous. When a person makes unreasonable noise or uses obscene or abusive language or gestures in public. When they disturb a public assembly. So let's say a town is having a town hall meeting about new zoning regulations, and you disrupt the meeting and you won't let people talk, or you blast megaphones or loud music to disrupt the proceeding. When you congregate or refuse a lawful order to disperse. An example of that would be the protesters in the photograph sitting in the street, and a police officer comes and says, hey, you're not allowed to block the street. This is dangerous. You need to get up and move somewhere else. And you refuse to do that. Or you create a hazardous condition. So if you're doing any of those things with the intent to cause public annoyance or alarm, then you can be charged with disorderly conduct. Disorderly conduct is just a violation. So the result could be, you get a ticket, or you have to go to court. Maybe you get a small fine of $25 or $50. Your punishment may even be community service, like you have to go pick up trash 3 Saturdays in a row to atone for the disorderly conduct charge. The important thing to remember about disorderly conduct is you don't get a criminal record if you are arrested or even convicted of disorderly conduct. It is a violation. So in the law, it has the same punishment as a parking violation or having a noisy party. Okay, so disorderly conduct charges in New York State do not result in a criminal record. This is a low-level crime that's usually resolved with a small fine that you have to pay in court. And notice in the disorderly conduct statute, what's our mens rea? What's the intent? So the intent here is to cause public annoyance or alarm. It's kind of vague, right? How are you going to prove somebody was trying to annoy or alarm the public? Well, what you're going to do is prove that they engaged in a fight, they were making unreasonable noise, they used obscene or abusive language or gestures, they disturbed a public assembly or meeting, they congregated and refused a lawful order to disperse, or that they created some kind of hazardous condition. That's what can get you a disorderly conduct charge in New York State. And remember, this is a violation. It does not give you a criminal record. Compare that to what we call obstructing governmental administration. This is also what people, sorry about that. It's also what people call obstructing justice, right? So obstructing governmental administration in New York State in the second degree means someone intentionally obstructed, impaired, or perverted the administration of law, or they prevented or attempted to prevent a public servant from performing an official duty. So some examples of these is your friends getting arrested for DWI and the officer has you pulled over on the side of the road and you get out of the car and you approach the officer and you start arguing with them and look, my friend's not drunk and you're out of line and you had no reason to pull us over. Doing something like that can get you arrested for obstructing governmental administration or what they call obstructing justice. It could also mean you're preventing or trying to prevent a public service from performing an official duty. So this could mean a police officer is trying to speak with someone or investigate a crime and you're up in their face and you're trying to get between them and the person they're talking to, or you're yelling and screaming and amping up the volatility of the situation. That could be attempting or preventing a public servant, in this case a police officer, from performing an official duty. So this is a Class A misdemeanor. So you could get up to a year in jail or $1,000 fine for this, and it creates a criminal record. So I want you to be able to distinguish the difference between disorderly conduct, which is a violation, and obstructing governmental administration, which is a Class A misdemeanor. And if you don't know the difference or can't distinguish between the two, well, you know what? That would be a great email to send me for your new participation requirement. So disorderly conduct is a violation, a minor low-level offense, no criminal record. Obstructing governmental administration, that is a Class A misdemeanor, a much more serious offense. And it's not hard to get charged with this. If a police officer is doing his or her job and they deem you to be interfering with them, you can be arrested for this. This often comes up in situations where a police officer is doing something and someone's filming it on their cell phone. And I'm sure you've seen those videos or that happening on Live PD or another show where a police officer is talking to someone or is in the process of frisking them, searching their personal items, and someone starts filming them. And oftentimes police officers don't react well to this. However, here's just a little guideline. If someone's filming a police officer, they need to do it in a way that is not obstructing or impairing what the police officer's doing. which is a short way of saying they need to back up off it and they need to step back. You cannot run up to a police officer who's doing their job and stick a cell phone 2 inches from their face. That can get you arrested, right? But if you're on a public sidewalk or you're otherwise staying, I would say 10, 12 feet away at least from what's going on, then you're less likely to get arrested or just make the cop really mad, right? So do you have the right to film it? Yes, technically you do, but you cannot obstruct, impair, or try to prevent the officer from doing what they're doing. And that doesn't mean just physically inserting yourself into the scene. It could also mean filming it. So just be careful about that if you're in that situation. So you've now reached the end of part 1, not the end of class. Don't get up and put your coat on and your book bag and start walking out the door. This is just the end of part 1. So it also marks the end of chapter 7. So chapter 7 was covered in the lecture of April 1 and this lecture, part 1. That's chapter 7. You're going to end this video and you're going to go watch part 2, which moves on to chapter 9. So your assignments for this week require you to prepare for a quiz, complete, submit project 7, and do some reading. And each one of those assignments is detailed at the end of part 2. So ready for part 2? Let's go there now.